already decided if we find money, we want to give our percentage back to the community that Pablo Escobar destroyed.
You're seeing shallow peaks, something's going on.
Where it is right here.
Because of its size, it could be a safe, could be an ammo box.
For years, people swapped stories about Pablo Escobar's secret vaults, massive stashes of money, gold, and who knows what locked away and lost to time. Most brushed it off as legend.
Whoa, what's that?
Oh, dude, that definitely looks like a box.
Just broke the top of the box.
Pablo could have hidden money at one time in this box, big enough for thousands of dollars.
But now, one of those vaults has actually been opened, and what was found inside is beyond wild. We're talking insane riches, strange artifacts, and chilling reminders of Escobar's power. It's the kind of discovery that proves truth can be even crazier than rumor. The Hidden Vault, in the Colombian countryside, where Escobar's shadow still lingers over abandoned estates and crumbling properties, locals have long whispered that buried wealth lay just beneath their feet. Some farmers even claimed to have stumbled on bundles of rotting bills while working their land. A few had stories of unmarked crates pulled from the soil, stuffed with dollars now useless from water damage and mold. But when a team finally uncovered one of Escobar's vaults, it felt different. This wasn't rumor anymore. It was proof. The vault was hidden with the kind of paranoia only a man like Escobar could imagine. Buried beneath reinforced layers of concrete and steel, it wasn't just designed to be secret. It was designed to be impenetrable. Getting to it took days of careful labor. Crews chipped away at barriers one by one, always unsure if they were breaking into treasure or simply another false lead. Opening it wasn't glamorous or cinematic. There were no gleaming doors swinging wide. It was dirty, grueling work, digging, drilling, and prying for hours just to break through the first seal. When the final barrier gave way, a stale gust of air rushed out, damp and heavy, carrying the scent of decay mixed with something metallic, like rust or old blood. The chamber had been sealed for decades, untouched since Escobar's men locked it shut. That first breath inside felt less like discovery and more like intrusion, as if the space had been waiting all these years for someone brave or foolish enough to step through. The room itself wasn't grand. In fact, it looked unassuming. 4 plain walls, no decorations, no signs of luxury. Yet the atmosphere was thick, charged with the weight of history. Dust clung to every surface. Water had seeped in through cracks, warping parts of the structure, turning corners of the floor into patches of mud. It was far from the polished image of a high-tech vault you'd see in a movie. This was practical, crude even, but effective. It had done its job. It had kept Escobar's secrets hidden. What struck the team most wasn't the vault's appearance, but its silence. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you notice your own breathing. Every step echoed off the walls, a reminder that they were the first outsiders to stand there since Escobar's reign. The place felt less like a storage room and more like a time capsule. An unopened message from the past, sealed away at the height of the crime boss power. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Flashlights swept across the room, catching the edges of containers stacked in the shadows. Some were crates, some were metal boxes, others were just bundles wrapped tightly in plastic. At first glance, it was impossible to know what was inside. But even from a distance, the shapes hinted at something extraordinary. This is where the story takes its sharp turn. Because what the team began pulling from the vault went far beyond the cliches of cash and gold. It wasn't just about money. It was about evidence of Escobar's life, his paranoia, and his unshakable grip on power. Each item dragged into the light was another piece of a puzzle the world thought it already understood. The truth, as it turned out, was far stranger. What exactly lay hidden in Escobar's vaults? What treasures could possibly match the legend? Escobar's unimaginable treasures. The first thing they uncovered was exactly what people expected: cash. Mountains of it. Bundles of US dollars wrapped in rubber bands, some crisp, others half-rotted from years of moisture. Whole stacks had fused together into solid blocks of paper, useless as currency, but staggering as a symbol. Even after all these years, it was clear Escobar had more money than he could ever count, let alone spend. Some estimates put the vault's stash at several $1,000,000, just sitting underground, slowly decaying. But the money was only the beginning. In the far corner of the vault were sealed metal trunks, their surfaces rusted but still intact. Cracking them open revealed gold bars, neatly stacked like bricks. Each one was heavy, gleaming dully in the flashlight beams. Proof that Escobar hadn't trusted banks or even cash when it came to storing his fortune. Alongside the gold were bags of jewels, loose diamonds, emeralds, and rubies spilling out of torn velvet pouches, as if someone had thrown them in hastily before sealing the vault. Then came the surprises. One crate contained weapons, AK-47s, pistols, even a few grenade launchers wrapped in oily cloth to keep them from rusting. Next to the weapons was a pile of ammunition, enough to supply a small militia. These weren't decorative keepsakes. They were practical tools of war, stored away in case Escobar ever needed to rise again from the shadows. The vault also held stranger, more personal items. A collection of photo albums was stacked against one wall, their leather covers warped by humidity. Inside were snapshots of Escobar with his family, smiling on lavish vacations, posing with politicians, even feeding animals at his private zoo. The images felt jarring, almost surreal. Here was the man known worldwide as a ruthless kingpin, captured in ordinary, even tender moments. Most shocking of all were the documents. Sealed folders filled with letters, receipts, and ledgers that seemed to map out parts of Escobar's empire. There were notes about shipments, coded transactions, and even names of people in high positions. Politicians, businessmen, maybe even international partners. If authentic, these papers weren't just relics. They were dynamite, capable of reigniting old controversies and rewriting parts of history. And tucked among all this chaos were oddities that didn't fit the pattern of wealth or war. Expensive watches still ticking faintly after decades. A collection of rare art pieces rolled up in protective tubes, some thought to be missing for years. Even a few luxury toys, motorcycle parts, old radios, and imported liquor bottles, long evaporated but still sealed. By the time everything was cataloged, the vault had given up more than treasure. It had given up a story of a man so rich and paranoid that he buried pieces of his life like insurance policies against the future. Each item, whether it was a gold bar or a faded family photo, revealed something about Escobar's contradictions, his obsession with control, his thirst for luxury, and his lingering need to keep a part of himself hidden. Mountains of rotting millions. The money was the first thing that hit them, literally. As soon as the team cracked open the crates, bundles of US dollars spilled out, wrapped in layers of plastic that had long since yellowed and split. Some stacks were still crisp enough to fan like playing cards, but most were swollen, stuck together by moisture, their edges blackened with mold. The sight was surreal. Wealth measured not in numbers but in sheer volume, spilling across the vault floor. No one bothered trying to count it right then. Estimates put it in the millions, maybe tens of millions, though the exact figure will probably never be known. Much of it was unsalvageable, ruined by time. Rats had chewed through some bundles, leaving shredded green confetti in the corners. Other stacks had hardened into bricks, more like relics than usable cash. Still, the message was clear. Escobar had so much money, he could afford to lose millions and not even notice. It was a strange irony. For years, rumors swirled that Escobar's cartel buried cash everywhere, in walls, fields, even under riverbeds. Farmers would occasionally unearth a stash while plowing, only to find the bills rotted beyond use. This vault was the proof those rumors weren't exaggerations. It was a snapshot of Escobar's problem of excess. He didn't just have too much money to spend, he had too much to store. Standing in front of those piles was both awe-inspiring and absurd. There was enough money to build schools, hospitals, or entire towns. And yet, for decades, it sat in the dark, forgotten. In a way, it summed up Escobar's empire perfectly. Immense power, wasted potential, and the constant need to hide. Power in shiny form. After the shock of the cash, the vault revealed something heavier, both literally and symbolically. Gold. Beneath the stacks of bills, the team found metal boxes lined with cloth, each one hiding bars stamped with bank markings, serial numbers, and in some cases, no markings at all. They varied in size, some small enough to hold in one hand, others so heavy it took two people to lift them. The dull shine of aged gold filled the space with a different kind of weight. Not fragile like paper money, but solid, timeless, impossible to rot. Gold had always been Escobar's insurance policy. Cash could decay, but gold survived. And in his world, it wasn't just a commodity. It was leverage. Gold could buy weapons, loyalty, or safe passage in places where US dollars meant nothing. To Escobar, it was more than wealth. It was power cast in metal. Alongside the gold sat smaller boxes that glittered in the flashlights, jewelry, watches encrusted with diamonds, chains thick enough to double as weapons, rings so large they seemed impractical. Some pieces looked gaudy, designed to flaunt wealth in the most obvious way. Others were subtle, classic designs that suggested they weren't bought for display, but for value. Every piece carried a story, perhaps gifted to a trusted lieutenant, perhaps seized from an enemy, or maybe just hoarded by Escobar himself in moments of paranoia. A few items stood out. A Rolex encrusted with emeralds, rumored to be custom-made. A gold crucifix so heavy it looked less like a religious symbol and more like a trophy. And a set of cufflinks carved into the shape of tiny pistols, a reminder that even Escobar's fashion carried a hint of menace. Unlike the cash, the jewelry and gold hadn't suffered much from time. They gleamed, untouched, as if waiting to be worn again. Seeing them all together, the team couldn't help but imagine the parties, the meetings, the moments where these items might have once sparkled on Escobar or his closest allies. It was wealth, yes, but also theater. Every shiny object was part of a performance, a way to intimidate rivals and dazzle friends. In the end, the gold and jewelry told a truth that the cash couldn't. Money could disappear. It could be spent, burned, or lost in the ground. But gold was permanence. It was Escobar's attempt to anchor his fleeting empire to something indestructible. a silent declaration. Even if I fall, my wealth will remain. Secrets more dangerous than money. If the cash and gold showed Escobar's wealth, the documents revealed his power. Hidden in battered briefcases and moldy folders, stacks of paper and notebooks were pulled from the vault, some wrapped in plastic, others left bare to the damp air. At first, they looked ordinary. Ledgers, receipts, scraps of notes. But the more the team studied them, the more it became clear. These weren't simple records. They were a blueprint of Escobar's empire. There were lists of names, coded entries, and financial transactions that linked directly to businesses, politicians, and even foreign contacts. Some pages contained meticulous tallies, payments made to officials, bribes for protection, or shipments logged with dates and amounts. Other pages were shockingly casual. Phone numbers scrawled next to first names, short notes like "paid in full" or "move to Cali." To anyone else, they might look like random scribbles. To Escobar, they were the pulse of a billion-dollar cartel. One notebook stood out more than the rest. Its pages were filled with Escobar's handwriting, neat but forceful, as if every letter was pressed with intent. Inside were notes about safe houses, offshore accounts, and coded references to political allies. Some historians believe that documents like these, if made public, could still embarrass powerful families in Colombia and perhaps even abroad. For decades, rumors have suggested that Escobar's influence stretched far beyond Medellin, into boardrooms and governments. These papers gave weight to those whispers, but not everything in the vault was business. Tucked among the ledgers were personal letters, some to his family, others never sent. They painted a different picture, a man torn between affection for his children and the paranoia that consumed him. One half-finished letter to his son read almost tenderly, a reminder that behind the violence was still a father. Another note, however, was a chilling set of instructions for what to do if he was killed, who to trust, where to flee, and who to silence. The documents were, in many ways, more dangerous than any gun or bomb Escobar ever owned. Money could buy loyalty, gold could buy weapons, but information could destroy reputations decades later. Holding those papers felt like holding live wires from the past, sparking with unfinished business. For the team, it was a sobering reminder. They weren't just unearthing treasure, they were unearthing secrets some people might prefer stayed buried. Beyond the money, what objects did Escobar keep to project both terror and untouchable status? Tools of fear and prestige. As the team dug deeper into the vault, the mood shifted again. Tucked behind the crates of money and boxes of papers were weapons, an arsenal that was equal parts practical and ceremonial. These weren't just tools of violence, they were symbols, carefully chosen to project both fear and prestige. The first discoveries were pistols, dozens of them, some wrapped in oily cloth that had preserved their shine for decades. A few were standard-issue sidearms, the kind carried by soldiers or police, but others were far from ordinary. One had gold plating along its barrel, with Escobar's initials etched into the grip. Another, an antique revolver, had ornate engravings curling across its frame, as if it belonged in a collector's case, rather than a kingpin's vault. There were rifles, too, military-grade assault weapons, some still functional, others corroded by time. A few were packed in grease to keep them ready for use, a chilling sign that Escobar hadn't just been stockpiling for vanity. He was preparing for war. And for a man who once fought the Colombian state, the DEA, and rival cartels all at once, That preparation made grim sense. But not all the weapons were meant for the battlefield. Scattered among the firepower were pieces that seemed more like trophies. One shotgun, inlaid with mother-of-pearl, looked as though it had been custom-made as a gift. A set of daggers, their hilts carved from ivory, were stored in a velvet-lined box. These weren't the tools of a soldier. They were props in Escobar's performance of power. Reminders that even his weapons had to be larger than life. What struck the team most was the duality. Some of the guns spoke of function. Weapons bought to arm his men, to defend his empire, to keep enemies at bay. Others spoke of theater, objects meant to impress guests, intimidate rivals, and remind anyone who entered his orbit that Escobar was no ordinary criminal. Standing in front of that collection was unsettling. It wasn't just about the firepower, it was about what those weapons represented. They were extensions of Escobar's personality, practical when they had to be, but always tinged with spectacle. Even in the shadows of his vault, his need to display dominance was unmistakable. The oddities. If the money, gold, and weapons fit the legend of Escobar, what came next pushed the vault into stranger territory. Buried between the crates and boxes were items that didn't quite belong. Oddities that revealed more about Escobar the man than Escobar the kingpin. The first surprise was art. Rolled canvases, carefully wrapped in protective sheets, were tucked into a corner. When unrolled, they revealed paintings thought to be lost, pieces smuggled out of Europe in the 80s, possibly stolen, possibly bought through shadowy channels. Some were signed by recognizable names, their authenticity still debated. Whether real or fake, they spoke to Escobar's appetite for prestige. He didn't just want wealth, he wanted to own beauty, culture, even history. Nearby, in a smaller crate, were stacks of photographs. Some were faded Polaroids, others glossy prints. They showed Escobar in settings the public rarely saw, laughing at private parties, posing with luxury cars, hugging his children. But there were also photos of Escobar with faces far more controversial, politicians, businessmen, even celebrities. A few of those images, if verified, could rewrite parts of Colombia's political story. Then came the personal keepsakes, a bundle of handwritten notes from his children, saved like treasures. Old cassette tapes labeled in his handwriting, their contents unknown but tantalizing. A pair of reading glasses, worn and scratched, tucked inside a leather case. These weren't the belongings of a cartel boss. They were the mementos of a man who, despite his empire, clung to small reminders of his family and his mortality. And, strangest of all, there were objects no one could easily explain. A taxidermy animal, preserved but decaying. A collection of vintage toys, still boxed, as if intended for gifts. Even a bizarre piece of jewelry shaped like a miniature crown. Possibly a gag gift. Possibly something Escobar wore in private moments of vanity. These oddities blurred the line between myth and reality. They showed that behind the legend of a ruthless kingpin was also a collector, a father, a man who indulged whims as much as he stockpiled power. It was messy, contradictory, and human, and in some ways, that made it more unsettling than the cash or the guns. By the time the team had sifted through the last of the crates, it was clear the vault was more than a storage room. It was a mirror of Pablo Escobar himself, chaotic, excessive, and contradictory. The cash spoke of his sheer abundance, the kind of wealth that couldn't possibly be managed, only buried. The gold and jewelry reflected his hunger for permanence and display. The documents showed his reach, how deep his influence went, how carefully he tracked every debt and favor. The weapons revealed both his readiness for war and his flair for intimidation. And the oddities, the art, the photos, the keepsakes reminded everyone that behind the myth of the ruthless kingpin was still a man, vain, paranoid, sentimental, even whimsical. Taken together, the vault was less about what Escobar owned and more about what he feared. He feared loss, so he buried money. He feared betrayal, so he kept records. He feared obscurity, so he clung to tokens of family and fame. Every item was a symptom of that paranoia, wrapped in the illusion of control. Escobar's life and rise. Long before the vaults, the billions, and the international manhunts, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was just a kid from Rio Negro, Colombia. Born in 1949 and raised in the nearby city of Medellin, he grew up in a modest household. His father was a farmer, his mother a schoolteacher. By most accounts, his childhood wasn't especially unusual. But Escobar wasn't content with ordinary. From an early age, he seemed to have an itch for more money, more status, more control. His first ventures into crime were small-time, stealing tombstones, reselling contraband cigarettes, even swiping cars. But he quickly showed a knack for two things that would define his future: boldness and business sense. Where others saw risk, Escobar saw opportunity. He didn't just want to make a living, he wanted to build an empire. By the 70s, that ambition collided with a booming market: substance. At the time, the U.S. appetite for the harmful substance was skyrocketing, and Colombia's geography made it the perfect launchpad. Escobar recognized the opening before most, and he dove in. He started by smuggling small quantities, but his scale grew quickly. Within a few years, he co-founded what would become the Medellin Cartel, the most powerful crime organization the world had ever seen. Escobar's genius wasn't just in moving product, it was in logistics. He built a network that could fly tons of substance into the U.S., hidden in planes, submarines, even inside everyday exports like bananas. His fleet of private aircraft alone was worth millions, and at the height of his operation, it was said that 80% of the substance entering the United States came from Escobar's cartel. And with substance came cash, more money than anyone could reasonably count. Escobar's fortune grew so fast that he literally ran out of places to store it. Reports claim he spent thousands of dollars a month on rubber bands just to bundle his bills. Some of his money was eaten by rats. Some were buried in fields. Some, as the vaults prove, were hidden behind walls and under concrete. Even Forbes took notice, listing him among the richest men in the world in the late 80s, with an estimated net worth of around $30 billion. And that's without adjusting for inflation. But Escobar's rise wasn't only about money. He understood the value of image. In Medellin, he styled himself as a Robin Hood figure. He built housing for the poor, soccer fields for kids, and handed out cash to families who had nothing. For many, especially the underprivileged, he was a hero, someone who used his fortune to lift up his community. That loyalty became a shield. When the police came looking, entire neighborhoods protected him, hiding him, refusing to speak against him. At the same time, his brutality was unmatched. Escobar's motto was simple: plata o plomo, silver or lead. In other words, take the bribe or take the bullet. Judges, police officers, politicians, few dared to oppose him openly because those who did often didn't live long enough to regret it. His power wasn't just in wealth, but in the fear he could summon with a single order. By the early 80s, Escobar wasn't just a harmful substance trafficker, he was a kingmaker. He had influence in politics, business, and law enforcement. He even ran for office, briefly serving as an alternate member of Colombia's Congress. It was a move that stunned his critics and showed just how far his reach extended. Of course, his rise also sowed the seeds of his downfall. The more powerful he became, the harder it was for Colombia and the United States to ignore him. His cartel's violence escalated: bombings, assassinations, kidnappings, and Escobar became the face of a war that threatened to destabilize the entire country. Still, it's impossible to understand the man without tracing this climb. From a restless teenager hustling on Medellin's streets to the leader of a global substance empire, Escobar's rise was as fast as it was ferocious. And it was during this climb that he built not only his wealth, but also the paranoia that led him to bury it in secret vaults, convinced that someday only hidden fortunes would protect him. How did Escobar turn his fortune into something far greater? An empire built on loyalty, intimidation, and absolute control. Power, influence, and fear. Pablo Escobar's rise wasn't just about trafficking substance, it was about how he bent an entire nation to his will. At the peak of his power, Escobar's influence reached into nearly every corner of Colombian life. Politicians, police officers, and even judges were caught in his web. Some were bought with staggering bribes, others silenced with bullets. Escobar didn't just operate outside the law. In many ways, he made his own law. The saying that defined his empire was plata o plomo, silver or lead. For a mayor, it might mean a briefcase of money in exchange for looking the other way. For a police commander, it might mean a choice between taking the bribe or risking a bullet in the head. And for many, the decision wasn't difficult. Why refuse Escobar when the consequences were swift and often deadly? This strategy gave him an extraordinary reach. Entire communities stayed loyal to him. Because he built homes, funded schools, and kept food on the table. He was feared, yes, but in some neighborhoods, he was also adored. To the poor, Escobar wasn't just a criminal, he was a benefactor, a man who did what the government never seemed to do. His generosity bought loyalty, and loyalty bought silence. Yet beyond the myth of Robin Hood, there was a darker side. Escobar unleashed a campaign of violence that shook Colombia to its core. In the late 80s and early 90s, assassinations of journalists, judges, and politicians became commonplace. Entire blocks were bombed in Medellin and Bogota, killing civilians alongside intended targets. Airplanes were blown up mid-flight just to eliminate a single rival or send a message to the state. The effect was chilling. For many Colombians, Escobar was not just a kingpin, he was the most powerful man in the country, a figure whose shadow loomed larger than the government itself. His wealth bought him influence, but it was fear that cemented his control. Even those who despised him often kept quiet, because speaking out was too dangerous. In a strange way, Escobar managed to embody both protector and predator. His supporters saw him as a shield against poverty, while his enemies, and even many ordinary citizens, saw him as a threat to peace, stability, and life itself. That duality, the mixture of admiration and terror, is what made him such a unique and enduring figure. And it's also why the vaults matter. They weren't just about storing riches. They were about ensuring Escobar's grip outlived any raid, arrest, or betrayal. They were about keeping his influence intact, even when the world turned against him. The vault's impact. The fascination with Pablo Escobar's hidden vaults isn't just about the money. It's about what those vaults represent, the intersection of myth, greed, and mortality. People are drawn to the idea that unimaginable fortunes could be lying just beneath the ground, waiting to be uncovered. It feels like treasure hunting mixed with true crime, a reminder that real life can sometimes outshine fiction. But the allure is complicated. On one hand, there's awe at the sheer scale of Escobar's wealth. Few figures in history accumulated so much power so quickly, and the vault is tangible proof of that excess. On the other hand, there's horror, because behind the gold and cash lies a story of bloodshed, corruption, and fear. Every bar of gold, every stack of bills, carries the weight of lives destroyed by his empire. What can you say about Escobar's riches and legacy? Leave your comments below and subscribe for similarly interesting stories.